Close Encounters and Alien Abductions. In this programme we look at 3 fascinating alien encounters where the witnesses allege direct contact with extraterrestrials. Cheshire River Weaver UFO incident. On 27th of January 1978, 4 men were trespassing on private land next to the River Weaver in Cheshire, England. They were hunting pheasants near an area of the river known as Devil's Garden. They were interviewed by UFO researchers who agreed that their identity would remain anonymous due to their behaviour on private land was illegal. The 4 men looked out over the water when one of them became aware of a strange object skimming just above the water. At first, they thought it was a Soviet satellite as an incident involving a satellite crashed in Canada, and it was a recent news headline. As they continued to view the craft, it headed over to the bank and was just 20 feet above the ground. At this point, the witnesses realised that this was a strange craft being intelligently controlled. The craft passed the witnesses, and they said they could hear a light humming noise and the sound of rushing wind. Many witnesses have described hearing rushing wind when witnessing a UFO, especially when it's at very low altitude. The estimated 15-foot diameter craft landed in full view of the witnesses, and by this point they felt uneasy. They described the craft as having flashing lights around the sides and glowing windows. All 4 men described the lights as hurting their eyes if they looked at it for too long. Researchers have suggested it may have been ultraviolet light. They feared radiation poisoning at this point because of the fuzzy lights, and they were about to make a dash for it when one of the craft's occupants left the craft, and the men decided to continue watching. They described the occupant as a humanoid, wearing a silver one-piece suit, with a helmet and a violet light on the top. The area around the light became bathed in the light's glow. Next, the being studied his surroundings, then the light was concentrated on a herd of cows in a nearby field. With that, the being went back inside the craft. A very short time later, 2 humanoid entities emerged from the craft, both dressed in the same suit. They were carrying a large silver cage which looked like it was made of metal. The beings carried this large cage as if it was very light. They headed in the direction of the cows. One of the cows appeared frozen to the spot, and the entities placed the cage around the animal. The men said they were not sure if they were measuring the animal or preparing the animal for transport. At this point, the 4 men decided not to hang around any longer, and they decided to run away from the scene. They ran to a bridge where they were able to cross the river. One of the men described feeling a pulling sensation as he ran away. He described it like an invisible force was dragging him back. He said he felt it particularly strongly on his testicles, which stayed sore for a week. He also had red marks on his legs, which were too painful to touch. The Jardim Alvorada UFO abduction. This alleged UFO abduction takes place in Jardim, Alvorada, South Brazil, on the 13th of April 1979, and the claimed UFO was also seen by several other people. At about 11:30 p.m, Joselino de Matos and his younger 13-year-old brother, Roberto Carlos, were walking home from their sister's house. The younger brother, Roberto, noticed a strange star in the dark sky, which he thought was following them. His older brother dismissed it at first, but a few moments later he sensed it was following them as well. As they were nearing their home, the oldest brother, Jocelyn, noticed a strange pulling sensation. It was as if he no longer possessed control of his legs, which took him and Roberto into a field next to the road. Under some strange force, the 2 brothers fell to the ground under a tree, and it was at this point that they both felt they had control of their legs again. Feeling shocked, the pair looked around and immediately saw that what they thought was a star was actually a completely soundless, disc-shaped craft. Next, the brothers claimed they heard a voice saying, "The job is not ended, we will be back." After awakening, shocked and confused, they headed for home but found walking difficult. They also said they felt extremely hungry. Arriving home, they claimed they both collapsed, breaking the door open. Their parents and siblings ran to help them back up onto their feet, where they told their parents what had happened. At first, their parents did not believe their sons, but they took their parents outside and the craft could still be seen, hovering silently over the trees. Their parents then thought that something out of the ordinary must have occurred. The two brothers began to tell their account of what happened on their journey home, when they both became aware of a pain which felt like an electric shock of some kind, and both brothers believe it to be connected to their encounter. After a time, the shock was so strong that they fell to the ground. Their parents and siblings attempted to help them up, but claimed they got a shock themselves whenever they touched them. The brothers also describe not being able to move, as if paralysed. This continued for some minutes, until the craft left the local area, where both brothers are said to have regained full control of their bodies. There was media and UFO researchers' interest into the events that evening, and eventually the older brother agreed to hypnotic regression. Joselino said that a short time after collapsing under the tree, somebody came and caught us. He described being floated into the craft through an open door on the side of the vehicle by invisible hands. Once inside, they both were lowered back to the floor, where they noticed two entities awaiting their arrival. They gestured to the brothers to follow them, which they did. Joselino describes that they entered a room full of computers, flashing devices, and what he thought was a command display. Another room was described as being full of motors, but said they were like nothing he had ever seen before. After passing through another room, which Joselino described as computer screens showing a picture of Earth, they arrived at something which was like a hospital, where he was asked to lie on an examination table. He believes they took several samples from him, including a sperm sample. He was then asked to sit on a chair, where he claims strange instruments were attached to his head. He could hear the two entities speaking in a language he could not understand. At this point, it is alleged, a strange woman came into the room who seemed mechanical and had sex with Joselino. After this, she said, perhaps the seed will come alive. With that, he felt paralysed again and exited the craft the same way he entered, then woke up under the tree next to his brother. At first, the pair were happy to talk of their encounter, but some ridiculed them, and they eventually stopped talking about their alleged experience. The abduction of Gerry Anderson. During the 1960s, Gerry Anderson, accompanied by his wife, witnessed a strange light in the sky. This sighting reminded him of an incident which took place during his childhood, which he had almost completely forgotten. In 1953, 12-year-old Gerry Anderson was on a summer camp, and whilst being engaged in a hide-and-seek activity with his friends and teacher, he decided to slip away into the woodlands. He laid under a tree and fell asleep. The next thing he knew was the teacher in charge, and very concerned for Gerry's welfare, was standing over him, insisting on Gerry to tell him where he had been. Gerry had no idea that he had been missing for 7 hours, and it was now 8 p.m. The teacher said he had organised a search party, and they had been searching for him for hours, and they had already looked in the same spot where Gerry now lays. Gerry had no recollection of ever moving. He just laid under the tree 7 hours ago and fell asleep. Gerry had red marks on the back of his neck and felt exhausted, and a doctor who examined him put it down to sunstroke. In 1978, Gerry decided to go to a hypnotherapist in an attempt to find out what happened that day. Upon reaching the woodland and relaxing under a tree, Gerry noticed a light in the sky which appeared to land in the woodland close by. Next, he noticed two strange figures heading towards him. Gerry wanted to get up and run, but he was paralysed and felt very frightened. He heard a voice in his head saying, "There is no need to be afraid." The two entities now stood either side of him, and it was at this point Gerry's body began to float towards the craft. Beside the craft, Gerry's paralysis disappeared, and he was told to climb a ladder on the side of the vehicle, leading up to a door or hatch. At this point, he got his best glimpse of his abductors and described them as classic greys with large eyes. As he climbed the ladder, he felt some form of pressure on his neck, which he believed that alleged aliens were responsible for. He next found himself in a brightly lit round-shaped room. Next, he was led to another room where another being stood in red attire. According to Gerry, this being in red clothing was older and possibly in charge. This being also called Gerry "my son." The entity in red got Gerry to look at a computer screen which showed planet Earth. Gerry started to panic again, and the entity in red touched Gerry's head, and he suddenly felt very calm. Next, Gerry followed the entity in red onto a long ramp heading downwards. At the bottom, a door was open where Gerry could see a dome-shaped room. Concerningly, it is claimed, it was full of children. Next, he was handed a strange globe, and Gerry clearly heard the words in his mind: "Understand, be taught." The next thing Gerry was able to allegedly recall was being in a room on his own. He decided to take a look around, when he noticed he was in the presence of a woman. As the woman approached him, Gerry became aware of the entity in red was also present. They noticed Gerry had a chain or necklace around his neck with a cross. The words, "It's not right to worship," entered Gerry's mind. He was then asked to watch a nearby screen, which he did. Gerry claims at this point he fell asleep, then woke up being carried back to the same spot in the woodlands by the entities. They placed him back down, where again he fell asleep. The next thing he could recall was his concerned teacher insisting on telling him where he had been for all those hours. Despite his teacher organising a search party, and obviously searching the woodlands for a number of hours, no one else saw anything paranormal on that day. Only Gerry. We make content covering all aspects of the paranormal and unexplained, so please like, subscribe and take a look at my other content. Thanks for tuning in.